Welcome to my podcast, and I'm in such a pretty, actually 18th century sitting room on the south-facing side of Highclere Castle. And my guest today is a very special lady called Lizzie Dunford, and we're going to be talking all things Jane Austen because she helps run Jane Austen's house, which is in Hampshire, and Highclere's in Hampshire. So she is one of the legends of this amazing county. Lizzie, thank you so much for joining me today at this podcast. It's a joy to see you. And actually, I haven't been to Jane Austen's house for some time, so may I ask myself there?
You may. The invitation is always open.
So, Jane Austen's house, explain to me where it is from Highclere, because I'm sure that many of our visitors to Highclere would also love to visit Jane Austen's house.
Oh, very much so. It's actually on the other side of Basingstoke, but you go through some beautiful countryside either side, and it's a journey that Austen would have known well. She grew up not far from Highclere, but you go southeast about 45 minutes, but it's not as far as it sounds, and you end up in the South Downs instead of where we are here at Highclere. It's still a very beautiful, the North Downs. It's still a very beautiful, very pastoral landscape. It's a village called Chawton that now is bypassed by the mighty A31. But in Jane Austen's time, the house that she spent the last years of her life was on that main road between Winchester and London and Gosport. So she was very, very much in the heart of things. And it's a very picturesque village full of thatched cottages. Every other house is a thatched cottage, apart from Jane Austen's house, which is a rather substantial brick-built Tudor house. But it is a very beautiful place and not far at all. And there's a beautiful connection and a beautiful connecting road between the two, and it makes a lovely joint pilgrimage.
I think so too. In 2017, we spent a week here celebrating 200 years since Jane Austen sadly died, and she's obviously buried in Winchester. And what I'm very excited about is that in 2 years' time, 2025, we're going to celebrate 250 years since her birth. She was such a remarkable woman, and her books, whether in film or in a normal, book form, have given millions and millions of people such pleasure. And I hope we can both work towards doing some wonderful tribute week to her perhaps then, and create an itinerary to take Jane Austen fans on a pilgrimage both from here to there and back again. But she was a remarkable lady, and I think she wrote most of her famous books in this house, didn't she?
Yes, so all of the novels, from Sense and Sensibility all the way up to the fragment that is Sanditon that she didn't finish, they are all either written or revised, or they come to their final form from this house. So it means that those incredible scenes that we love so much, Lizzie Bennet striding out across the Hertfordshire countryside in the novel, in reality, they are written and they have come to that final form. We're not quite sure, particularly Pride and Prejudice. She did start some of that in Steventon, but their final form, they come from this house. And it is an extraordinary privilege to care for it, but it's also just incredible. It still gives me goosebumps to know that you are in the space and you can see the table that she wrote these on.
So you've still got the original writing table?
We have her writing table, that her novels that we know she wrote on. She wrote in the dining room in front of a picture window that looked out onto this main road, onto this street, which is really significant when you consider Emma. She's writing Emma there. Emma is completely a product of that house, and it's such a novel of a village, and she's writing it from this perspective where she can look out. And her writing table is very small. It's a side table, a small 12-sided table, and she did also have a writing desk, which is owned by the British Library, but we still own the table, and visitors, you walk through the room of the dining room and it's there and it's spotlit, and to know, I often think of it almost as a vortex that spirals down so much, such an industry, such an iconography, so many words that matter to so many people's well-being. They all spiral down to a point from this tiny little table in the corner of the room, and it's magical.
May I ask, where are the first editions of her novels? Who holds those? Do you have any of them, or in the British Library?
Yeah, we have an extensive collection of Austen first editions. Each of the novels had a different number of first editions.
Yes.
So I think Pride and Prejudice is obviously the one that's most well known. That has a first run of about 1500. So there are first editions all over the world. We are very lucky in our collection that we actually own the full set of first editions that belong to her brother Edward, who was, we often call him the lucky brother. He was adopted by a family called the Knights and inherited. They were childless and owned vast estates both in Hampshire and Kent and a bit in Winchester. And she, when she was published, her own author's copies, which you all know well, she would gift them to her brothers, and we own the complete set that were given to Edward. And you open them, and inside the front cover there's Edward Knight, Godmersham Park, and he then gifted them on to his daughter, and you have her name in them. So we own all of those. We own,
and of course he owned the house, didn't he?
He owned the house, and it was through him that they came to live there. Her father retired as a vicar. He was vicar of Steventon until Austen was 26, and he retired there in 1801. And they then went to Bath for a few years. She didn't like Bath. She didn't write very much. She didn't write anything apart from a fragment called The Watsons when she was in Bath. He passed away 4 years later. The money starts to dwindle as the head of the household disappears, and they then go and live in Southampton for a little bit with her brother Frank. And then in late 1808, Edward offers them a choice of two houses, one being near his principal estate where he spent the vast majority of his time in Kent, and the other being in Chawton, which suited Mrs. Austen down to the ground. So this is Jane's mother. A lot of her sons were there, and it's quite interesting. The more you delve into the family history, it often feels like the Austen women are kind of shunted off. It's a big family. Austen was one of two sisters, but out of a family of 8, and it often feels like they're shunted off. But when you really look through the chronologies and through all the letters, they're really at the heart. This is a very close family, and I often think of them as being almost as the hub of a cartwheel. You know, brothers are in the Navy, they're coming up from Southampton, and you still have a brother at Steventon and in London and in Kent, and they're all coming, and they come to this house that is the heart of not just Austen's writing, but it is really the heart of a family, even though it's probably the most modest house that they all can come to. But I think it shows those family ties are really, really strong, and we see that reference to family and particularly sisterhood in her novels so strongly.
I think you do. I'm one of 6 sisters.
Yes.
And and I think the opening chapter of Pride and Prejudice is just brilliant.
It is.
So listeners, if you haven't read the opening chapter of Pride and Prejudice, please read it. It is just brilliant, yes. Setting out the whole of the book that is to come, which was actually originally called, obviously, First Impressions. And, you know, my mother was always teased. She was Mrs. Bennet, which she really didn't want to be, and nor did we want to be put out there as trying to find someone to marry. So I and my sisters determinedly forged our own careers and way forward. But so much of what Jane Austen wrote about, it still matters so much to us in everyday life. How you do the coincidence, how you do find the person, the people you met, the marry, the families you make, the good luck or bad luck, which also dogged her life as well. And her sister Cassandra, and the letters between the two of them. And Cassandra's great love lived at Kintbury. So I did find a reference in a letter to them riding past Lord Carnarvon's park.
There is.
I looked for such a long time. I read every letter. And then I felt I'd done the whole lot until I came across it, which was so exciting.
Yeah, and poor Cassandra, her fiancé passed away, which was very sad, and she then didn't marry. It was just her Tom for her, so there was nobody else afterwards. But I think you're absolutely right. Austen remains so relevant. I think there are very, very few authors, and ever have been very few authors, that can capture Austen's understanding of what motivates people and the way they understand them, and the way she captures relationships, both positive, and she revels in the negative interplay between people.
Emma, for example.
Emma is just fabulous, and the characters that she creates, in particular, Mansfield Park, Mrs. Norris, Mrs. Elton, these almost witch-like characters that she creates that would also be so dominant in a village environment as well. She would have known those people. And I think that's what's so powerful about Austen, that you can open her novels 210 years now after they were written, after they were published, and you can still see people that you know. They might have different names, and they might be having slightly different life experiences, but essentially they're very similar. And she understands emotional development and emotional and social development. And if you look at some of the theories around the development of emotional and social intelligence, they're almost following Austen plot lines. They are. You see the way that she starts her heroines, every single one, how they start out the novels. And it is about their process of self-development. Yes, they happen to get married at the end, but it's the changes that they experience and those tragedies that...
Persuasion.
Persuasion.
And I find Persuasion an extraordinary novel.
It is.
And, it sort of kind of hits you very strongly. And I suppose perhaps there were the strongest resonances to the disappointments in her own life, although in Persuasion there is a better ending. But you think about the undone years and the wasted years and the miscommunication. I find that very powerful. But, when you think of the Knightleys in Emma, and presume that's also a play on, her brother Edward Knight. So, and then, the name Frank or Mansfield Park, all the different things that come forward.
Her names matter. Names matter in Jane Austen. They really do, particularly Mansfield Park, which there's a long history behind, and it is very, very significant. She is making these really important allusions all the time, and frequently they are coded the way that people, and when they're published, particularly the significance around Mansfield Park when it was published in 1814, people would have understood the significance of that name, which is that it's the only one of Austen's novels that is named after a house, despite the fact that houses are so crucial to every single one of Austen's novels. And Lord Mansfield was very involved in some of the campaigns around slavery, and he was the uncle of Dido Bell, who grew up at Kenwood House. So there is, and that would have been shorthand. In 1814, everybody would have known what that would have meant. So it was a deeply powerful and quite political novel at its time, which is not necessarily something you'd associate with Austen, to say she's writing a political novel, but there are certainly aspects of that in her work.
She was acutely aware of what was going on. I couldn't be less, so. Given that her strong naval background and family background, and the risk that you took going out there. And of course, one of Lord Carnarvon's, the first of Carnarvon's sons, living here at the same time, went to sea, but sadly died at sea. So it's the loss that every family suffered, and the fear and loss in her family as well.
Very much so. I mean, although it was after her death, her brother Charles, who was in the Navy, he died at sea. He died over in Burma of yellow fever. Cassandra, Austen's fiancée, he died at sea. And one of Charles, his first wife, she died after giving birth on board a ship. So what might have happened to Anne Elliot, but we've hopefully didn't happen to Anne Elliot. So it was ever present. And I think what's quite remarkable about Austen's novels is considering how at risk life was in her time. We don't see that in the novels. There are very few deaths in the novels, and when they are, they usually help things. I think particularly about Mrs. Churchill in Emma, when she dies, she makes everything happen at the end. So it is quite extraordinary that despite this, or they happen off stage, or they happen behind the scenes, she's certainly not writing melodrama. She's writing, but it's still not realistic at the same time. There's far less death in Austen's novels than there would be in a realistic representation of the Regency, which was
I think there is less death, but I equally well think that she needed sometimes to... My take on it is that she left some of the challenges of her own life situation behind to enter into the world that she created and create a more positive ending. And as her life developed at her house, at Jane Austen's house, it didn't take such a positive slant. And all the letters surrounding her own incredibly sad death in Winchester, every single time I read them I cry. It's entirely hopeless.
And the letter that Cassandra writes after her death, is heartbreaking. I've lost such a sister, the gilder of every care, and every story. It's incredible. And it really is the great, you can't avoid this tragedy of Austen dying so young, because she's between 1809 and moving into Jane Austen's house and her death. So, Sensibility is published in 1811, Pride and Prejudice 1813, Mansfield Park 1814, Emma 1816. By the end of 1816, Persuasion is finished and ready to go, and she started on Sanditon. And then by May 1817, she's too ill to carry on. And you think I can't really think, although I am obviously biased, so I am shaped with Austen, how many other authors there are who have written in that short space of time that many novels
which
that are still so good and still
good.
So widely read and translated in so many languages and read around the globe, and that means so much. She really is, she is unique and she is unparalleled, really. I am biased, obviously, but I really can't, there are other authors that writing over a break of time, but that many hits in that short space of time is really incredible. And that is the tragedy. I mean, they're all good. What else would... I mean, her brother Frank, who was one of the middle brothers, he lived till 90. What would she have produced if she lived to 90? But it means the ones that we do have are such treasures and such gems, because they are so rare. Every word written by Austen is rare. Every word is a treasure. We only know the content of 161 letters that she wrote out of 41-year life of someone who communicated a lot. And we don't even know the whereabouts of all of those. Some of them are still, we know what's in them, but we don't know where they are. So it's so precious. And they're also meaningful. They matter. Austen really matters. But I would say that. I would say that.
She does matter. I don't know why, but she does hold the hearts of so many people, men and women around the world. Absolutely. Which is extraordinary. I have to say, my husband is not a fan of Mr. Darcy, so I'm going to call a dog Darcy next or something, because that would be quite funny. But I think it's because he regards him as such a paragon that with what he sets out, and also he changes.
It's his change. It's the change in Darcy that I think is really interesting, and again is influential in so many things that we see it in so many other novels and in so many other films. The sort of trope of the character that changes and mellows, but so does Elizabeth Bennet. She gains that when she comes back to and Wickham is still trying to see if he's got a chance, and he asks, how was Mr. Darcy? I think he was the same in essentials, but in knowing him better, I understood him more. And that is the way that Austen interplays that they both have to change and they have to meet together. And of course, the influence of Pemberley and the influence of the house is important, and that's sensed in all of Austen's novels, which deeply reflects her own experience of housing insecurity, is this search for her heroines of a safe and secure home. They all open, possibly with the exception of Emma, but they open with their home at threat. They're at risk, and the Dashwood sisters are made homeless at the start of that novel. The Bennet sisters, the estate is entailed. Unless they marry, their future is very uncertain. Anne Elliot, Sir Walter Elliot, has spent all the money. There's nothing left. They've got to move. They're all at risk, and home and the house and that sense of place and the connection with land is important. And it's important in her male characters, the way they look after their estates. I think particularly of Henry Crawford, who's a bit profligate with his, compared to Darcy, and that dichotomy in Pride and Prejudice between Mr. Bennet, who isn't looking after his estate, and Darcy, who, it's just fascinating. They're so multi-layered. But yeah, the home is important. But Darcy is a difficult. He's a paragon. He's come up there as an icon.
Well, at the end he is.
At the end he is. Yes, and I do think that proposal raises. It's fascinating to watch that and read that with a modern perspective. Around questions of consent and around women's voice. Austen presents this Darcy who's so confident that she's going to accept him, just because of who he is, even though she really hasn't actually given him any encouragement, and is quite horrible to him a lot of the time, but he's so convinced. And the way that Austen portrays this man who takes a knockback, and the way she prioritises the women's voice is really quite inspiring. But he does need that. He does have that knock. It's a big knock. It does change him.
It is a big knock. I think so many of my own books that I've written here, the subtitle often, just for the moment, is A Sense of Place.
Yes.
Because I think this house you may not be aware, but the earliest records are 749 AD, the written records.
Yeah.
So that sense of anchor, of reassurance, of being grounded, of the way the trees are, the walks, the ha-ha, the sense of people living there, and the sense of whether you can continue to live here. You still, again, are exposed to that risk, which I think many of the people who have watched Downton Abbey also sense. And the success of Downton Abbey has, I think, partly because Highclere is so real.
Yes.
And it grounds people in it. So it's been, in that way, a really interesting partnership. Yeah. And whenever I read Jane Austen's novels, I understand Emma's Village. You can draw a map of it.
Yes, you can.
You understand where the Bennets live. You can understand how the house works and the wonderful scenes that are set in it. Or and again, that some of the terrible scenes at Persuasion. You know where she is. You draw in your breath, or Lyme Regis, or Bath, or Southampton. So many of the small scenes which build up the bigger picture are so well grounded. You can walk out along the pier at Lyme Regis. It's that is also part of it. So she's writing both from where she's been, and about just people who she's just tweaking a little bit.
She is.
I often think she's met Mrs. Bates somewhere.
I think she's met Mrs. Bates. Well, what's quite fascinating is when you look at her letters, the way she punctuates them, her own letters in her own voice. It's very similar to the way she puts Mrs. Bates' voice down on the page, which is just interesting. Her use of her own voice. I think that's quite interesting as well. Though when it comes to Austen's voice, is each of the novels has a slightly different narrator's voice, and then you have letters, and letters at the time are very much a public performance. They'd be read aloud. There are some bits where she says, "Don't read this bit out loud," usually when she's being quite phenomenally horrible about people. But I think another of the sadnesses of Austen is we don't have her diaries. We don't have Austen talking her to herself. We have Austen talking to a reader and Austen talking to Cassandra. But I think it'd be wonderful to have heard what Austen talking to herself sounds like, because I suspect it'd be quite punchy, different again, quite punchy. Yeah, I think it'd be fascinating.
Like you, Lizzie, I would love to have read her diaries to gain that insight into a far more sophisticated woman than perhaps is generally considered today. So. And if she weren't writing diaries today, which is done by very few people, what do you think she'd have been on?
I don't know. I think she would definitely have had an opinion about it. She would still have been writing. You couldn't stop. You couldn't stop Austen writing. And I think she would be writing. I mean, in her time, she's writing satires of the society that she's writing, and she'd still be doing that. I think she'd enjoy Twitter. I think she'd get into some good Twitter arguments. Her letters reveal quite a complex woman. She was incredibly fond of her family, and particularly her nieces and nephews adored her. She was a real influence, and she was really important to them, and was seen as a very kind, very compassionate, very giving person. There are, for people outside the family, sometimes the perception is slightly different. There is a contemporary writer, Mary Mitford, who describes her as being a long, tall stick in the corner of the room. And when they found out it was her that was publishing, they all became rather scared of her because they didn't want to be in the novels, which I think is interesting. Yeah, and you do see that in the letters. She is frequently really quite horrible about people. And this is a slightly difficult topic, so I do, for anybody listening, aware of this. In one of her letters, she describes somebody who's lost a child. Had a miscarriage, and she says it must be because the baby has caught sight of its father.
Golly.
So there is a cruelty. There is a cruelty to Austen in the letters, and that's not the only instance of that. You do see that. You do see that through. So she was.
I think sometimes the humour is a way of dealing with something which actually is quite close to her heart, because she wasn't married and able to have children.
No.
And she loved her nieces and nephews.
She did, very much so.
And I just know from my own family that some of my sisters have not had children, some of us have. And it's different ways of dealing with what the hand of cards that you're given in life. And I think she ended up having to accept it. And I think that word acceptance comes across, and yet the fight not to accept it in so many of her novels. And I was struck the other day how Miss Bennet, the eldest Miss Bennet in Pride and Prejudice, goes to London to try and find her proposed love. So she's not entirely passive.
No.
She does go up there and yet doesn't, because of the malice, the forethought of others.
Hopes he'll come as
Hopes
well.
he'll come, and it's that hope and that lost hope, and back she comes. So it's that trying to find a way forward, not to accept only the commiserations of life, and to find those moments of happiness, which some of her heroines do find. So I always hope that she and her sister Cassandra in particular found some moments of happiness in their lives.
I think they did. I think they found a lot of happiness. I think they were living quite an unconventional lifestyle. There's a wonderful book published recently called Square Haunting by Francesca Wade that talks a lot about the women active in the Bloomsbury group in the 1920s. Virginia Woolf, Dorothy L. Sayers, and it's a fabulous book. And all the way through, it's talking about how revolutionary these women are, that they are choosing to live in an all-female household. And it's wonderful, thoroughly recommend it. But all the way through, I was thinking, Austen is doing this. Austen's doing this 100 years before. They are living in this household where they are supporting together. They're supporting each other. There is a real role carved out for each of these women. Mrs. Austen, having brought up 8 children, lost a husband and had all sorts of various, by the time she dies, 30 nieces and nephews. She doesn't have to do anything in the house. Cassandra and their friend Martha Lloyd, who's also their sister-in-law, they look after the household, and it really frees up Austen to be able to. Her job is to cook breakfast, and she orders the wine and the tea, which I think is a rather good way to do it. But they are supporting each other.
Do you put out tea and wine in the house to look after them all?
Sadly, there's no wine, but there is tea. There's Martha Lloyd, who was really interesting in her own right, actually. We have one of our many treasures, actually, is what's called the Martha Lloyd Household Book, and it's her collection of recipes and sort of there's things to how to cure a dog bite. Fascinatingly, there's a recipe for ink in it, and those recipes would have been cooked in the kitchen, and she took them on later. She actually ended up marrying Jane's brother Frank as his second wife, but there's a lot of recipes for alcohol in there. There's mead, and there's orange wine and spruce wine and all sorts of different things. And what a very interesting thing we see through Austen's letters, the last full year of her life was 1816, which was the year without a summer. It was a big volcanic eruption which had an impact on the meteorology all over the world. One of the most famous literary outputs of that is Frankenstein, because the Shelleys and Byron are in Lake Geneva and the weather is so horrible. Even in the summer, they start telling ghost stories. So it's a really important meteorological year. We see it in the Austens because Jane is complaining that the bees haven't been very good because they can't make as much mead as they would do otherwise. So that's how we see this impact of the weather in this last year of her life. Is there's not quite as much mead made as normal. So there's one of my favourite parts of Austen's letters as she writes when she's past it in her early 30s, or early to mid 30s, is how sweet it is to go to the balls and be the chaperone and to sit in front of the fire with a glass of wine.
Oh, how nice.
It's lovely. I think one of the real light bulb moments for me when I always knew she was brilliant, obviously, but was a rereading of Sense and Sensibility. Now, it's been published for over 210 years, so I'm not going to apologise for any spoilers. But in it, there is a character called Edward Ferrars, who, as it turns out, has been engaged to a character who's been living in Exeter secretly all through the novel. But right at the very beginning, he is clearly forming a tendresse for the eldest Dashwood sister, and they are moving to Devon. And there's this very wonderful bit at the very start of the novel where Mrs. Dashwood says, "Oh, we're moving to Devon," and everyone goes, "Oh, where? How far from Exeter?" And she says, and of course, when you read that the first time, it doesn't matter. You don't know, but Austen has placed that. And it's just so clever, because you are supposed to, on the first reading, think it's because Edward wants to know where Eleanor's going. And of course it's not. It's because but you can't see that on the first reading because you don't know what. And I think a writer that places those things that aren't snares, she is demanding and expecting that her novels are going to be reread. To put something in like that, it's just, it's just genius. And she was so widely read. There's one of the letters that she writes where she's reading something about the British military peace in India, and as well as all these fabulous novels, Samuel Richardson, Maria Edgeworth, Fanny Burney. She's a subscriber to one of Fanny Burney's books to help it get published. She's just reading voraciously everything, and it comes out. There are all sorts of literary allusions in her novels. She loves Shakespeare. She loves Cooper. She's very interested in history. One of her fabulous teenage writings is a short history of the British monarchy, where she has all the facts that will probably be not correct. It's very satirical, and she's very team Mary Queen of Scots rather than Queen Elizabeth, which is the daughter of a Church of England minister, is really interesting. But yes, she's just fascinating and does reward. I think that's what's so interesting is the confidence that she has in her writing and in herself. She very much believes in her writing. This is a choice. This is a choice for her. It's not something that she falls into, and is often her mid-Victorian biographers, who she's all related to, they sort of tend to suggest it's some accident. She just sits in the corner and it all comes up. No, it's worked out, it's practiced, it's honed, and she's so proud of it. So proud of it. When Pride and Prejudice is published, she receives her copy. We are very, very privileged to own the letter that she writes the day after, and I've held it, and it's just one of the most extraordinary treasures in all of English literature. The letter that she writes the day after it's been published, and she says that she has received her darling child from London, and that is her own copy of Pride and Prejudice, which sadly we don't know where it is, so if anybody has it and wants to make a good home of it, it will be very well received, but no one knows where it is. But they are extraordinary. They mattered to her a lot, and she researched them. And when she's writing Mansfield Park, she asks Cassandra to ask if Northamptonshire is a country of hedgerows, so she can help inform the landscape that she sets Mansfield Park in. But it's just brilliant. But I could say it's brilliant again and again and again.
No, it is. I find the past and Jane Austen and her books entirely fascinating, and I have read and reread her books many times. Every time I explore something different with them. I have favourite parts. I can definitely own up to that. But the way she constructs the sentences, and I suppose because I've tried to write, and I can see that over the last 10 years my writing has improved and got better, and you shape the words better, you shape the paragraphs, you lead the reader on better. And the last 10 years of her life were also the result of the earlier 20 years.
Very much so, very much so. And one of our trustees is a fabulous scholar called Catherine Sutherland, who's done a lot of work on Professor Catherine Sutherland, who's done a lot of work on the teenage writings, and she really describes those. Austen starts writing at 12, and she's writing all through her teenage years, and Professor Sutherland really talks about how those are experimenting. If you look through those teenage writings, which were only first published in 1923, Virginia Woolf, who loved Austen, writes a lot about them, but you can see she's taking all these different styles. So there's some written in play form, there's poems, there's satires of the novel bestsellers of the time, and she's practicing. What is really fascinating about these, though, is from the word go, she writes dedications. So they are all, each of them is dedicated to a brother or a friend, Martha Lloyd, or there's a wonderful, lovely, very short, very strange piece called The Beautiful Cassandra, which is dedicated to Cassandra. She said, "Madam, you are a phoenix, you are beyond compare." And it's got a novel in 12 verses, and it's just this madcap adventure around London. So she is practicing, and she works through these, and then you see through them. It's wonderful. They're all published, and it's wonderful to see them in order as they get longer and longer and longer. And you have Kitty or Catherine or the Bower, and then you have Lady Susan, which is still rather scandalous today. It's a really good one. It's not what anyone would, people who've come to Austen from very much the balls and bonnets camp, and that perception of it's just about nice girls getting married, reading Lady Susan is really quite eyebrow raising. And then from there she goes on to Eleanor Marianne, which is written in epistolary form, so what will eventually be revised to Sensibility and then First Impressions. So it's a continual redrafting and revising and improving and perhaps this is what she wants, and she's really, really working at it at a time when for women of her class it was very difficult you couldn't really have a career. To have a career meant you had dropped out of her sphere of polite society. but she wants to be a writer, and she works really hard at it. And what's even more fabulous when you see there are very few Austen manuscripts, very, very few, no manuscripts for any of the full novels. There are only a few fragments. So there's a fragment of Sanditon, which she sadly didn't finish, she passed away, and the fragment of the Watsons, and there is a cancelled chapter of Persuasion. But the fragment of the Watsons, which again I've been very lucky to hold and see, it's at the Bodleian Library, is astonishing. So again, it only gets 12 chapters long. She doesn't continue it, she doesn't progress it. But even in that, you can see she reworks. So there are every writer works in different techniques. Some people like to get everything down and then come back and revise. But Austen is revising as she goes. She comes back and she scores out and she reworks. And that's only a first draft, so it's really refined. There's a really lovely thing in the Watsons works. Paper was precious and expensive, and she's got a bit that she really doesn't like, and she's cut out another piece of paper to stick over the top. And it's actually held on with a dress pin. So it's pinned in. So you can see this ferocious mind getting it all out and not able to stop. And at the time, dresses were often held together with pins. So I often imagine her sitting there. She probably wouldn't have been writing by candlelight, but it makes it more romantic that she's sitting there frantically getting these ideas out and getting them onto paper, and she just pulls out this pin and puts it in, and it's just remarkable to see this work of art in progress. It's one of the great sad. If I saw the manuscript of Pride and Prejudice, I mean, I can't imagine what that would feel like to see her handwritten draft. Well, you can see what you can see. The thought of holding that is really quite overpowering. But yes, she is a master of her craft, and she served a long apprenticeship to get there.
She did, and I think it's interesting for me because obviously I've tried to write, I've enjoyed it, and the latest book I'm quite proud of because it's. I can see how I've developed from my earlier books and how you try to bring the reader in. And whereas to start with, I just wanted to tell a story. Now it's a lot more sophisticated layers of what I'm trying to do. But what's interesting for me is I'm conscious also of the reader in a much bigger way. And funnily enough, you can be the first here. I'd like to try to give some prizes for readers because as an author, today, readers can do many things. They can listen to podcasts, they can watch TV, watch their iPad, but actually readers matter because you're waiting for someone to turn the page to wonder, well, what happens next? Or I'm consciously changing a style. I wonder if they notice that because I'm trying to bring them in. So I thought, actually, I have a history festival every October, and I'd like to highlight that a little bit more with having a series of prizes for readers. And so that I think that would be really interesting. It might be quite fun to also include a Jane Austen book in that. I was trying to set out a novel biography, let people choose a little bit, but as we're coming round into that time. So that's, I was thinking of, anyway, readers today, that's where I started. It is,
and I think that's also, as you say about, and we've talked a lot about the things that Austen leaves in the novels for her readers, and I think you're absolutely right. It is the mark of a good author that they're not just thinking about what they want to say, that the book is a piece of two-way communication, because the reader brings themselves to it. And there is one of the interesting things about Austen's novels, when they were first published, they were in 3 volumes, which is the way that books were published at the time, and now we see them in 1. But when you do see the original volumes, not in every novel, but in some of them, there is a cliffhanger. She doesn't do it in every novel, particularly in Emma and in Pride and Prejudice, when the volumes stop and there is that dum dum, and which is one of the things that makes it so beautifully easy to adapt, because she is thinking about that, and you stop and she builds in. So they are a dialogue, but of course the time when Austen is writing, which is one of the such sad things we've lost, is that books were read aloud. They were performed. Austen herself, again, in this letter,
I wanted to do some of that again, because I think the opening chapter of Pride and Prejudice just begs to be read out.
It does.
But again, Emma is fantastic.
Emma is wonderful.
I mean, honestly, I laugh so much every time I begin it.
Yeah.
It's just absolutely brilliant. I mean, there have been some excellent films which I have really enjoyed, and where they've captured some of the tonality of Austen, which is much more subtle perhaps than might be given credit for another one.
It is. I do it's the fabulous opening chapters of Austen's novel. They are always, particularly the opening chapter of Persuasion, which is just gently savage, isn't it? The way she describes Sir Walter Elliot and how he's opening the baronetage, but that particular bit about the house is full of mirrors, and the way that I have this very strong vision of her vision's the wrong word, imagination of her writing, and almost laughing to herself, and there's really quite steely look in her eye as she's thinking about writing these characters and shaping them. But she did read her own novels aloud. Again, in this fabulous letter, she talks about how after she'd received her copy of Pride and Prejudice, she and her mother invite a friend called Miss Ben, who lived in one of the thatched cottages over the road, which Austen describes as a wretched hovel. It's very much not a wretched hovel today, to come over, and after dinner they read aloud the first volume of Pride and Prejudice in the drawing room at Jane Austen's house.
How
and it's
amazing.
Extraordinary. At the time, Austen was publishing anonymously, so she doesn't say, which is a whole other question of why she's publishing anonymously, which we don't know the answer to. But it is really quite extraordinary. And she says that Miss Ben she enjoyed herself. How could she help it, poor thing, with two such readers? So we almost have to imagine them doing voices and impersonating. So these are novels that are designed to be performed. And we know that from things that particularly her nieces have said, that she would almost read them aloud. She'd read a bit and she'd read it aloud to Cassandra. So there is an element of them being workshopped, or also following some of the techniques that
shared. I mean, it's about shared. I think it's storytelling that was shared. And I did English, so I was studying Chaucer and some of the earliest writings, and they were designed to be read out loud. And often I also studied Anglo-Saxon English.
Ooh, fabulous.
And again, that's to be read out loud.
Is.
So the isolation which we seem to have moved towards in this society is something I would love to push back on.
Yes, the idea of a solo reader is really quite a modern concept. It was I think it's wonderful. I'd love to.
Oh, well, let's have a go at lots of things.
Let's do it.
We've got a couple of years to plan a lot of fun projects.
Lots of fun projects.
Austen.
Yeah,
definitely.
wonderful.
And I think I might start with some sort of reader prizes.
That would be wonderful. Really wonderful.
We can carry on. Thank you, Lizzie.
You're very welcome.
So much for joining me today. Thank you. Hello, this is Lady Carnarvon, and just to say, please do subscribe to this podcast. Then you can be first on the list every time it comes out.